Brush of Madness. Chapter 1. The first thing people noticed about Elias Green wasn't his voice, though that honey baritone could soothe the most restless soul. Nor was it the way his hands moved with practiced precision, as if every stroke of his brush was predestined. No, what stood out about Elias was his eyes, two glacial orbs that seemed to pierce through the veil of the mundane and into something far more profound. Those eyes now gazed through the flickering static of Willows Hollow's local TV station, staring directly into the homes of its unsuspecting citizens. Sarah Campbell, curled up on her threadbare couch, frowned at the television screen. She sipped her coffee, lukewarm and bitter, and tried to make sense of the man before her. Elias Green had come out of nowhere, taking over the small-town channel with his show, Painting with Elias. The concept was simple: a canvas, a brush, and Elias himself, guiding viewers through the creation of tranquil landscapes. Yet, there was something unnervingly magnetic about him. "Now, just a soft stroke here," Elias murmured, his voice a lullaby. He swept his brush across the canvas, revealing the beginnings of a sunlit forest. The trees seemed to shimmer, their leaves so lifelike Sarah half expected them to rustle in a phantom breeze. "Every painting tells a story, doesn't it?" Elias continued, dipping his brush into a murky red. "Sometimes, the stories whisper. Other times, they scream." Sarah shivered, her journalist instincts bristling. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about Elias was off. His calm demeanor felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. And his paintings, beautiful as they were, carried an undercurrent of unease, as if the brushstrokes were laden with secrets. Across town, others weren't as critical. Willows Hollow had quickly become infatuated with Elias Green. He was a sensation in their quiet little corner of the world, a celebrity in a place where the biggest news of the week was usually a new casserole recipe at the diner. People tuned in religiously, marveling at the way his hands danced across the canvas, turning blank white into scenes that felt alive. But it was one painting in particular that changed everything. It happened during an otherwise uneventful Thursday evening. Elias began by describing the inspiration for the piece, a peaceful riverside. As the camera zoomed in, his brush crafted the delicate ripple of water against the rocks. Trees leaned over the edge, their gnarled roots reaching into the dark depths. The scene was serene, until someone noticed the detail in the background. The next morning, Sheriff Paul Reynolds stood by that same riverbank, squinting at the sunlight glinting off the water. His deputy had called him down after receiving an anonymous tip. Sure enough, nestled in the roots of an old willow tree, they found the remains, a decomposed body, nearly unrecognizable. By mid-afternoon, the town was buzzing. Whispers spread through the coffee shops and grocery aisles, the name Elias Green passed from mouth to mouth. Had he known? Was it just coincidence? And why hadn't he mentioned that particular tree when describing his painting? Sarah, always hungry for a story, decided to dig deeper. She rewatched the episode, her fingers hovering over the pause button. It wasn't just the tree, she realized. In the shadows beneath the roots, Elias had painted something faint but unmistakable, a hand, pale and lifeless, reaching out from the earth. She rubbed her temples, trying to reason it out. Maybe it was an accident, she thought. An odd play of light and shadow. But the unease in her chest refused to subside. It wasn't just the painting that bothered her, it was Elias himself. His words, his expressions, even his movements, they all felt calculated, as if every moment on screen was part of a carefully crafted performance. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah had made up her mind. She would find out who Elias Green really was. And so, as the rest of Willows Hollow tuned in to watch Elias paint another idyllic scene, Sarah began her investigation. What she didn't realize was that she wasn't just chasing a story, she was stepping into one of his paintings. One that had already been planned, down to the last stroke. Chapter 2. The sound of an old dial-up tone hummed in Sarah's ears as she scoured the digital corners of the internet for information about Elias Green. His name, surprisingly, yielded little. No biography, no interviews, not even an old class photo tucked away in some forgotten yearbook archive. It was as though the man had materialized from thin air, brush in hand, to grace Willows Hollow with his enigmatic charm. It was unnatural, she thought, for someone with such apparent talent to have no past. Even reclusive artists left breadcrumbs, a gallery showing, an art school certificate, maybe a scandalous arrest for tagging a subway wall in their youth. But Elias Green? He was a blank canvas. Her frustration grew with every dead-end search. She leaned back in her chair, her dimly lit apartment offering little solace. The flickering glow of her computer screen illuminated the stacks of half-read books and empty coffee mugs crowding her desk. Her instinct screamed that Elias was hiding something. The television in the next room droned on, his velvety voice drifting into her workspace like an uninvited guest. "Let's bring in some deeper colors now," Elias said, his tone as soothing as a lullaby. "You see, shadows aren't just the absence of light. They're the places where truth rests, waiting to be discovered." Sarah froze. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, his words laced with an unsettling intimacy, as though he were speaking directly to her. Slowly, she got up and walked into the living room, the creak of the floorboards cutting through the quiet. On the screen, Elias's latest painting took shape. It was a meadow bathed in golden sunlight, a creek winding through its center like a silver ribbon. But in the foreground stood something that didn't belong, a single, crooked tree with twisted branches that clawed at the sky. Her stomach churned. She knew that tree! Pulling on her jacket, Sarah grabbed her car keys and headed out. The meadow was exactly as she remembered it from her childhood, a sprawling field of wildflowers, their colors muted by the encroaching twilight. The creek gurgled softly, winding through the grass like a secret whispered to the earth. And there, at the edge of the clearing, was the tree. It stood just as Elias had painted it, its gnarled branches weaving a macabre tapestry against the fading light. Sarah approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she expected to find, perhaps nothing at all. But as she circled the tree, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The ground beneath the roots was disturbed, the soil darker and looser than the surrounding earth. It wasn't just a random patch of dirt. Someone had dug here. She dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as they brushed against the soil. With every handful she unearthed, the faint metallic smell of decay grew stronger. Then, her fingers struck something hard. Sarah recoiled, her breath hitching as she uncovered the edge of a human skull. Back in town, the buzz around Elias Green had only grown. His paintings were becoming more intricate, more vivid. He was the talk of every coffee shop, every PTA meeting. The sheriff's department, however, had grown increasingly uneasy. The discovery at the riverbank had stirred up old ghosts, cold cases they thought would never be solved. Sheriff Reynolds sat in his office, the painting of the riverside pinned to a bulletin board behind him. He studied it for the 100th time, his gut telling him it was more than a coincidence. But without solid evidence linking Elias to the scene, there was nothing he could do. Then the call came in. When Sarah burst into the station, her hands still caked with dirt, Reynolds could only stare. She recounted her discovery in a frantic rush, the words tumbling over each other. The sheriff, skeptical but intrigued, sent a deputy to investigate. An hour later, he returned, pale-faced and silent. "It's real," the deputy confirmed, setting the unearthed skull on the table in a carefully sealed evidence bag. The room fell silent. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. If Elias's paintings weren't just art, if they were maps, breadcrumbs leading to the resting places of his victims, then she had stumbled upon something far darker than she had ever imagined. But how? How could he know these locations with such precision? Her thoughts were interrupted by the deputy's voice. "Sheriff, you should see this." He held up a photograph. It was a printout from the show's latest episode, the painting of the meadow and the crooked tree. But this time, something was different. In the painting, the roots of the tree were now bare, the soil beneath them gone. And in the exposed earth was a hand, reaching out from the depths. Chapter 3. The air in Sheriff Reynolds' office was thick with disbelief and unease. The photograph of Elias Green's painting sat in the center of his desk, its details impossible to ignore. The hand emerging from the soil wasn't just a flourish of artistic whimsy, it was a precise, almost clinical rendering of what Sarah had found under the crooked tree. Reynolds ran a hand through his thinning hair, his eyes darting between Sarah and his deputy. You're telling me this guy painted the exact spot where you found a body, before you found it? Sarah nodded, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. I don't think it's just coincidence. He's hiding something, Sheriff. And he's using his show too. She hesitated, the weight of her realization making her stomach churn. To document it. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, the creak of the old wood loud in the quiet room. He didn't believe in ghosts, psychics, or any of the other nonsense that seemed to grip small-town imaginations. But this defied logic. Alright, he said finally. We keep this quiet for now. If he's involved, we don't want to spook him. Sarah, I want you to stay out of this. Let me handle it. Sarah bristled. With all due respect, Sheriff, I found the damn body. I'm not backing off now. Reynolds shot her a look, one that said he didn't have time to argue. Just don't do anything stupid. Meanwhile, Elias Green was preparing for his next episode. The studio lights cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the blank canvas in front of him. He moved with deliberate grace, his hands steady as he arranged his brushes and paints. Ah, there you are, he said, smiling into the camera. His voice dripped with a warmth that felt more like a trap than a comfort. Today, we're going to explore something a little darker. Shadows have their own beauty, don't they? They hide things, protect them. But sometimes, they reveal. The audience, blissfully unaware of the growing storm, hung on his every word. As he painted, the scene came alive, a desolate barn standing alone in a sea of tall grass, its wooden planks weathered and rotting. The details were hauntingly vivid, the broken windows, the rusted wind vane spinning lazily atop the roof. Elias paused, his brush hovering over the canvas. Funny thing about barns, he mused. They hold memories. Stories. Secrets. This one? It's got a story to tell. Sarah watched the episode with bated breath, her fingers gripping the armrests of her couch. She recognized the barn immediately, it was on the outskirts of town, abandoned for years. As Elias's brush continued its dance, she felt a creeping sense of inevitability. She couldn't wait for Reynolds to act. The sheriff was methodical to a fault, and every passing hour felt like an eternity. Grabbing her coat, she made up her mind. The barn loomed before her, a silhouette against the cold glow of the moon. Its once red paint had faded to a sickly gray, and the surrounding grass whispered as the wind threaded through it. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the warped wooden boards of the barn door. She pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Cobwebs clung to the rafters, their silken threads trembling as though disturbed by unseen hands. Her flashlight swept across the floor, revealing scattered debris, rusted tools, rotted hay, the skeletal remains of small animals. Then she saw it, a patch of earth in the corner, unnaturally smooth and free of debris. Her heart hammered in her chest as she approached. Kneeling, she brushed away the loose dirt, revealing a sliver of fabric. She pulled harder, uncovering what she had dreaded most, a body, its features twisted in a grotesque mask of terror. Behind her, the barn door creaked shut. Sarah spun around, her flashlight beam trembling. "Who's there?" she called, her voice breaking the heavy silence. A shadow moved in the corner, just beyond the reach of her light. And then she heard it, a soft, familiar voice. "You shouldn't be here, Sarah," Elias said, stepping into the light. His smile was calm, almost gentle. "You've been digging where you don't belong." Her blood turned to ice. "How? How did you know?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with a strange mix of amusement and menace. "Because, my dear," he said, lifting a brush from his pocket, "I painted it." Chapter 4. The barn seemed to close in around Sarah, the darkness pressing against her like an unwelcome embrace. Elias stood just beyond the reach of her flashlight, his paintbrush dangling from his hand as though it were an extension of his body. "You're an artist," he began, his voice honeyed and soft, "when you can see the world for what it truly is. The parts others ignore. The shadows they avoid." His gaze was piercing now, his smile sharp as the edge of a blade. Sarah took a step back, her instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. "You're sick," she spat, her voice trembling. "You think you can get away with this? The sheriff?" Elias chuckled, the sound low and rumbling, like distant thunder. "Ah, the good Sheriff Reynolds! Do you think he'll stop me? Do you think he'll even understand?" He motioned toward the patch of unearthed dirt where the body lay. "They're pieces of a greater masterpiece, Sarah. Each one part of a tapestry only I can see." Her breath hitched as he stepped closer, the beam of her flashlight catching the streaks of paint staining his hands. There was no mistaking the colors, earthy browns, deep reds, muted grays. He had used them to bring life to his twisted creations. "You killed them," she said, her voice hardening. "All of them." Elias tilted his head, his expression shifting into something almost childlike. "Killed? Such a crude word! I gave them purpose. Immortality." He gestured to the walls of the barn, as if unseen paintings hung there, waiting for an audience. "Their stories live on in every brushstroke, every shadow. They're part of me now, and soon." His voice dropped to a whisper. "You will be too." Sarah lunged for the door, her flashlight clattering to the floor as her hands scrabbled at the rotting wood. Elias moved with unnerving speed, his grip like iron as he grabbed her arm and spun her around. "Don't fight it," he hissed, his smile now a grotesque parody of the warm persona he projected on television. "You're destined to be something beautiful." She twisted free, adrenaline surging through her veins. In the chaos, her hand brushed against something heavy, a rusted crowbar lying among the debris. Without hesitation, she swung it with all her strength, the metal connecting with Elias's arm. He let out a pained grunt and staggered back, clutching his wrist. The brush fell from his hand, splattering paint on the barn floor. Sarah didn't wait to see if he would recover. She bolted through the door, the night air hitting her like a slap to the face. The long grass tangled around her legs as she sprinted toward her car, parked at the edge of the property. Behind her, she could hear him. His footsteps were steady, unhurried, as though he were savoring the chase. "You can't escape the canvas!" he called, his voice carrying over the field. "Every path leads back to me." She reached her car, her hands fumbling with the keys. The lock clicked open, and she threw herself inside, slamming the door shut. Her trembling fingers found the ignition, and the engine roared to life. In the rearview mirror, Elias stood at the edge of the tall grass, his silhouette illuminated by the car's taillights. He didn't run after her, he didn't need to. Instead, he raised his hand, as though offering a painter's wave goodbye. Or perhaps a promise. Back in the safety of her apartment, Sarah locked every door and window before collapsing onto her couch. Her mind raced with images of Elias, the body in the barn, and the eerie calm in his voice. She knew she should call the sheriff, but something stopped her. On her television, Elias's show played on a loop, his voice hauntingly familiar. She grabbed the remote to turn it off, but froze when she noticed something new. The painting he worked on was no longer the barn. It was her apartment. Every detail was there, the peeling wallpaper, the cluttered desk, the couch where she now sat, staring at the screen. And in the foreground, a figure stood outside her window, peering in. She whipped around, her heart in her throat, but the window was empty. For now. Chapter 5. Sarah sat frozen, the remote slipping from her trembling hand. The painting on the screen felt alive, its details sharper than any of Elias's previous works. Her apartment, her sanctuary, rendered with chilling precision. The figure outside her window was little more than a shadowy blur, but its presence was undeniable. Her breathing came in shallow gasps as she forced herself to look back at the television. Elias's voice hummed in the background, calm and methodical, as though narrating her growing fear. "And now," he said, his brush gliding over the canvas, "we add a little detail. Just enough to let them know. We're watching." The camera zoomed in on his hand, deftly adding a streak of crimson to the figure in the window. The motion was so fluid, so deliberate, it felt as though he were painting in real time, as if he could see her sitting there, paralyzed. Sarah's mind screamed for action. She grabbed her phone and dialed Sheriff Reynolds, her fingers fumbling over the keypad. The line rang twice before his gruff voice answered. "Reynolds here." "It's him," she blurted, her voice trembling. "Elias, he knows where I live. He's painting it right now. You have to come." A loud crack from outside cut her off. Her head whipped toward the window, where the faintest ripple in the curtain hinted at movement. "Sarah?" The sheriff's voice barked through the phone. "What's going on?" "He's here," she whispered, clutching the phone to her ear as she rose from the couch. Her knees threatened to buckle, but she forced herself forward, creeping toward the window. The curtain fluttered gently, as though stirred by an unseen hand. With a shaking breath, she yanked it aside, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness outside. Nothing. Just the empty street, bathed in the pale glow of a flickering street lamp. The wind howled, rattling the loose pane in its frame. "Sarah?" Reynolds' voice was sharp now. She turned back toward the room, her heart pounding. "I think he's toying with me. Sheriff, please." The lights flickered once, then went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you feel utterly alone. Sarah fumbled for the flashlight she'd set on the coffee table, her hands brushing against the smooth surface of the remote instead. Then she heard it, the soft, deliberate scrape of a brush against canvas. It came from the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. She swung the flashlight around, the beam catching nothing but her own clutter, a stack of old books, a leaning floor lamp, the framed photograph of her parents. But the sound persisted, steady and unyielding, like a metronome keeping time with her fear. "Elias?" she called, her voice a fragile thread. The scraping stopped. A laugh echoed through the apartment, low and mocking. "You really shouldn't have gone to the barn," his voice purred, seemingly from nowhere and everywhere at once. Sarah backed toward the door, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "Stay away from me." "Oh, Sarah," Elias continued, his tone almost regretful. "You've seen too much now. But don't worry, you're not alone. You'll join them soon." The shadows in the corner shifted, and for a moment, she swore she saw him standing there, his pain-streaked hands reaching toward her. But when she blinked, he was gone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the sudden vibration making her jump. She fumbled it out, the sheriff's number still on the line. "I'm on my way," he said before she could speak. "Stay put, and don't let anyone in." "I don't think I have a choice," she muttered, her eyes darting around the room. Minutes felt like hours as she huddled near the door, every creak and groan of the old apartment sending her nerves spiraling. When a knock finally came, it was so loud and abrupt she nearly screamed. "Sarah? It's Reynolds!" Relief washed over her as she unlocked the door and flung it open. The sheriff stood there, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Are you alright?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room behind her. She shook her head. "He was here, Sheriff. I swear it." Reynolds stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping over the cluttered space. "No sign of forced entry," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but her attention was drawn to the television. The screen was black now, the episode over, but something new had appeared. A single sentence scrawled across the darkness, in white letters that seemed to glow faintly. "The painting is never finished." Reynolds followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "What the hell?" Sarah's stomach twisted. She didn't need to be told what it meant. Elias wasn't done with her. Not yet. Chapter 6. Sheriff Reynolds stood rooted to the spot, his flashlight beam fixed on the ominous message glowing on the television screen. Sarah could feel the weight of his silence, the skepticism he tried to mask. She knew what he was thinking, this was just some twisted prank. But she also knew the truth, Elias was playing a game, and she was the unwilling pawn. "What's going on here?" Reynolds muttered, his tone laced with irritation. "This guy! You're telling me he's broadcasting threats directly to you?" Sarah hugged herself, her voice shaking. "I'm not imagining this, Sheriff. That barn, the painting, the body. He's not just an artist. He's a predator, Reynolds finished grimly, his hand instinctively moving to the holster on his belt. He took a long breath, his eyes narrowing. "Alright. Let's be smart about this. Do you have anywhere else you can stay tonight?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm not running from him. If I leave, he'll just find me again." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "If you stay, you're giving him exactly what he wants, control." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call. The screen lit up with a single text message from an unknown number. "Check the painting on your wall." Her blood ran cold. She didn't want to look, but the words felt like a command she couldn't ignore. Slowly, her gaze turned to the framed painting that hung above her couch, a serene landscape she'd bought at a flea market years ago. "Sarah?" Reynolds' voice brought her back to the moment. "It's nothing," she lied, her voice hollow. She couldn't bring herself to tell him about the message. But the sheriff noticed her glance at the painting. "What is it?" he pressed, stepping toward the wall. "No!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "Don't!" Reynolds ignored her, his hand reaching out to tilt the frame forward. The back of the canvas was exposed, revealing something that hadn't been there before. A smear of red paint, still wet, formed a crude yet unmistakable shape, a pair of eyes staring directly at them. The room felt as if it had dropped 10 degrees. Reynolds recoiled, his flashlight shaking slightly. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off the paint. It was as though the eyes were alive, following her every move. "He's been here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Reynolds pulled out his radio, his tone curt. "This is Reynolds. I need backup at..." The signal cut out, a burst of static replacing his words. He tapped the radio, frustration evident on his face. "Damn it!" Sarah's phone buzzed again. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, the new message sending a shiver down her spine. "Did you like my addition? You'll find the next one in the closet." Her stomach twisted into a knot. She glanced at the small closet door near the kitchen, its chipped white paint suddenly more menacing than she ever thought possible. "Sarah?" Reynolds' voice brought her back to reality. "What did it say?" She hesitated, knowing that opening the door could mean walking straight into Elias's trap. But if she didn't? "It's nothing," she lied again, trying to keep her voice steady. Reynolds caught the flicker of fear in her eyes. He stepped toward the closet, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. "Stay back," he ordered. The air was thick with tension as Reynolds reached for the doorknob. It creaked loudly as he turned it, the sound echoing in the silent apartment. Sarah held her breath, every muscle in her body taut with anticipation. The door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness. Reynolds shone his flashlight inside, illuminating a tangle of old coats and a pair of muddy boots. But then he saw it! At the back of the closet, barely visible against the shadows, was another canvas. It was propped up against the wall, its surface gleaming with fresh paint. Reynolds crouched to inspect it, his flashlight casting eerie shadows across the painted image. His breath caught in his throat. The painting depicted Sarah's apartment, but not as it currently was. In this version, blood smeared the walls, pooling on the floor beneath the couch. And slumped in the corner, staring lifelessly at the viewer, was a disturbingly accurate depiction of Sarah. Her face went pale as she saw it, a scream clawing at her throat. That's me!" Reynolds stood, his face a mask of grim determination. "We're leaving! Now!" The sheriff led her to his patrol car, his eyes scanning the empty street for any sign of movement. He didn't say much as they drove, the silence punctuated only by the crackle of the radio, still plagued by static. Sarah stared out the window, her mind racing. Elias was always a step ahead, his actions calculated, his message clear. She wasn't just a target, she was part of his masterpiece. And as they drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in the painting were still watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Chapter 7. The cruiser's engine hummed low against the quiet night, the dashboard lights casting an eerie glow over Sarah's pale face. Sheriff Reynolds drove in tense silence, his jaw set like granite. Outside, the world passed by in muted blurs, suburban homes, darkened storefronts, and desolate streets that seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah clutched her phone in her lap, its screen dim now, but the messages from Elias burned in her mind. Every nerve in her body felt taut, her breath shallow as if Elias's unseen eyes were pressing against her chest. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice small in the confined space of the cruiser. Reynolds' hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Someplace safe. We'll sort this out once I've got you out of his reach." "But what if he's already ahead of us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Reynolds glanced at her, his gaze stern. "Then we deal with it. But I'll be damned if I let him get to you without a fight." Sarah wanted to believe him, but the pit in her stomach told her Elias was playing a game they couldn't win. They pulled into the gravel driveway of an old hunting cabin tucked away in the woods. The building loomed in the darkness, its weathered wood and shuttered windows giving it the appearance of a forgotten relic. "This place belongs to a friend," Reynolds explained as he stepped out of the car, scanning the tree line with a practiced eye. "Nobody knows about it? We'll be safe here." Sarah followed reluctantly, her legs heavy with dread. The cabin's front porch creaked underfoot, the sound sharp against the oppressive quiet of the forest. Reynolds unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping a switch that bathed the room in the warm glow of a single overhead bulb. The interior was spartan but clean, a small table with mismatched chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and a cot pushed up against one wall. "It's not much," he admitted, setting his flashlight on the table, "but it'll do." Sarah nodded absently, her gaze flitting around the room. She couldn't shake the feeling that Elias was already here, lurking in the shadows, his presence as tangible as the scent of pine and dust. Hours passed in uneasy silence. Reynolds kept watch by the window, his hand never straying far from his sidearm. Sarah sat on the cot, her knees drawn to her chest, staring blankly at the floor. The isolation should have felt like a reprieve, but instead, it magnified her fear. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees, seemed to carry Elias's voice. Then the power flickered. The bulb above them dimmed, buzzing faintly before plunging them into darkness. "Stay here," Reynolds ordered, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. He pulled out his flashlight and headed toward the door. "Wait," Sarah hissed, her heart racing. "Don't go out there." "I'll be fine," he assured her, though the tightness in his voice betrayed his own unease. The door creaked open, letting in a rush of cold air. Reynolds stepped outside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the night. Sarah sat frozen, her ears straining for any sound beyond the rhythmic pounding of her heartbeat. Seconds stretched into minutes, the silence oppressive. Then she heard it, the unmistakable scrape of a paintbrush against canvas. It was coming from inside the cabin. Her breath hitched as she turned toward the sound. The flashlight Reynolds had left on the table flickered to life, its weak beam illuminating the far corner of the room. There, propped against the wall, was a canvas she hadn't noticed before. The image on it was half-formed, the brushstrokes crude but unmistakable. It depicted the cabin, its window cracked open, and Reynolds standing just outside. But in the painting, something else was with him, a shadowy figure emerging from the trees, its features obscured by swirling darkness. "No," Sarah whispered, backing away from the canvas. The paint seemed to glisten, wet and alive, as though it was being applied at that very moment. She stumbled to the door, her shaking hands fumbling with the lock. "Reynolds!" She screamed into the night, her voice cracking with panic. The sheriff's flashlight beam wavered in the distance, but he didn't respond. "Reynolds!" She called again, her desperation mounting. A sudden crack of branches made her spin around. The tree line rippled with movement, the shadows thickening like oil spreading across water. And then she saw it. A figure emerged, its outline eerily familiar. Elias! His face was obscured by the low brim of his hat, but she could feel his eyes on her, cold and calculating. In his hand, he held a paintbrush, dripping crimson onto the forest floor. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm and lilting. "The way art imitates life. Or is it the other way around?" Chapter 8. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Elias stood motionless at the edge of the forest, his shadow long and distorted under the pale moonlight. The paintbrush in his hand glinted wetly, and the sinister curve of his lips hinted at triumph. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice trembling. She clutched the doorframe, her knuckles white, as if the fragile wooden structure could protect her. Elias tilted his head, amused. "You're afraid, aren't you? Afraid that this little masterpiece I'm creating will end the way all masterpieces do, with a signature." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you want?" He took a deliberate step forward, the sound of his boots crunching against the gravel sharp and deliberate. "Want? Oh, Sarah, I don't want. I create. And you," he raised the dripping brush, pointing it toward her. "You're my magnum opus." Behind her, the canvas in the corner seemed to pulse, the paint shimmering like molten metal. She could hear the sound again, the ghostly scrape of bristles against the surface, though Elias hadn't moved. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. She glanced back at the painting, dread curling in her stomach as she saw its latest addition. It now showed her standing in the doorway, her face etched with terror. But something else had appeared, a figure looming behind her, its shadow stretching impossibly tall. A sudden chill ran down her spine. She spun around, expecting to find the cabin empty. But it wasn't. Reynolds stood in the doorway, his expression blank. His flashlight dangled loosely in one hand, the beam swaying erratically. "Sheriff?" she whispered, taking a cautious step toward him. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes, glassy and unseeing, shifted past her, locking onto Elias. "Don't!" Reynolds croaked, his voice barely audible. "Don't let him!" Before he could finish, his knees buckled, and he collapsed in a lifeless heap. Sarah screamed, rushing to his side. She shook him, her hands slick with sweat and panic. "Reynolds! Wake up!" But he didn't respond. His skin was cold, his body limp. Elias's laughter sliced through the night, sharp and mocking. "Oh, Sarah, you're wasting your energy. He's part of the art now. A brushstroke in the grand design." She shot to her feet, fury overriding her fear. "You're insane?" He shrugged, unbothered by her accusation. "Genius is often mistaken for madness. History will vindicate me. You, however..." He gestured to the canvas with a flourish. "You'll immortalize me." Sarah's gaze darted to the painting, the terror in her painted reflection more vivid than her own trembling body. She felt the world closing in, her options narrowing. But then she remembered the gun, then reach. With shaking hands, she yanked the weapon free, its weight unfamiliar but empowering. She aimed it at Elias, her finger hovering over the trigger. "Back off!" she shouted, her voice breaking. Elias didn't flinch. He merely smiled, the paintbrush swirling deftly between his fingers. "Do it," he urged. "Pull the trigger. End the scene? But remember..." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Every choice is a brushstroke. Are you sure this is the one you want to make?" Her grip faltered, her mind racing. Was this another trap? Another layer of his twisted game? The painting behind her seemed to thrum with life, the colors swirling chaotically. She risked a glance over her shoulder and gasped. The figure in the painting, her reflection, was holding the gun now. But instead of aiming it at Elias, it was pointing the barrel at her own head. Panic surged through her. She spun back to Elias, desperate for answers. "What is this? What have you done?" Elias chuckled, stepping even closer. "It's simple, really. Art is about perspective. And yours," he reached out, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her cheek, "is flawed." She pulled the trigger. The deafening crack of the gunshot shattered the stillness. Elias staggered back, a crimson stain blossoming across his chest. His grin faltered, replaced by something unreadable. Sarah stood frozen, the gun slipping from her hands as it clattered to the floor. For a moment, it seemed like it was over. Elias's body crumpled to the ground, his paintbrush rolling away, leaving a smear of red in its wake. But then the cabin began to change. The walls warped and twisted, the shadows deepening into impenetrable voids. The painting in the corner erupted in light, its colors spilling out into the room like liquid fire. Elias's body twitched, his head lolling to one side. His eyes snapped open, glowing with an unnatural brilliance. "You can't kill the artist," he rasped, his voice distorted and otherworldly. "Not when the art lives on." Chapter 9. Sarah's heart raced as she stood in front of the canvas, the room around her unnervingly still. Her hands were shaking. Every part of her wanted to turn and run, to leave behind the blood-soaked horrors she had uncovered within the cabin's walls. But she couldn't. Something kept her rooted in place, unable to tear her eyes away from the canvas that had come to life before her very eyes. Elias was gone. Or, at least, he was supposed to be. His paintings remained, though. They lingered in every corner of the room, each image a haunting tribute to his madness. Faces of the people he'd murdered, each one twisted with pain and terror, stared back at her from the canvas. They were no longer just victims, they had become part of Elias's twisted narrative. And now, the final piece, the last unfinished stroke, was waiting for her. The last body. The last story. "You'll finish it, won't you, Sarah?" Elias's voice slithered into the air, smooth and insidious, as though he were still there with her, watching, waiting for her to fulfill the final requirement. His presence, although gone, still permeated every inch of the room like a suffocating fog. "It's what you were always meant to do. Complete it. Become part of it." The words echoed in her ears, twisting her resolve into something fragile and brittle. She stood frozen, her breath shallow, the room pressing in on her like an endless void. She looked at the canvas again. The last face, the one she had refused to paint, the one she had avoided. It was staring back at her now, eyes wide, pupils dilated with terror. But it wasn't someone she knew. It wasn't even a person at all. It was her. Sarah? Her own face, twisted with fear, staring back at her from the canvas. Her stomach churned violently as she realized the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. This final piece of the puzzle was hers to finish. The body she had been unwilling to paint was her own. And now, the brush lay in front of her, just waiting. It gleamed with that same malevolent hunger that had driven Elias to madness. The bristles looked like something alive, something that belonged to the very creature that had haunted her throughout this nightmare. The brush had become more than just a tool. It was a vessel of darkness, an instrument to create the very horror she had tried to escape. Sarah reached out with trembling fingers, unable to stop herself. She felt the brush's cold surface in her palm, and the sensation sent a jolt of pure terror through her spine. The final stroke, the one that would complete the picture, the one that would finish her fate, was now in her hands. With the brush poised in the air, Sarah hesitated. She could hear Elias's voice, urging her to finish it. But something in her snapped. She wasn't going to be his puppet. She wasn't going to be another body to be painted on his twisted canvas. She threw the brush to the ground, and it landed with a hollow thud that echoed through the room. The cabin seemed to react to the sound, the walls shaking as though a great weight had just been lifted from them. But the air remained thick with the same oppressive energy, still brimming with the remnants of Elias's madness. Sarah turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. She just had to get out, away from this place, away from the nightmare she had somehow been dragged into. But as she reached the door and shoved it open, she felt it, a cold, invisible hand gripping her by the throat. A sensation of being dragged backward, away from freedom, back toward the canvas. The cabin was alive. Elias's art had become alive. She looked back over her shoulder and saw the faces from the paintings, all of them, crowding the doorway behind her, their eyes fixed on her with that same unrelenting hunger. They weren't just trapped in the art, they had become a part of it. And now, they wanted out. And Sarah? She was the last missing piece. The brush rose on its own, as if guided by some unseen force, and in that final moment of despair, Sarah understood. It was never about painting. It was about becoming a part of the madness. And no matter how hard she ran, no matter how much she fought, there would always be one final brushstroke waiting for her to complete. Chapter 10. The cabin seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Every board, every creaking beam, every flicker of shadow in the corner of her eye felt like a heartbeat, thumping in rhythm with her own frantic pulse. Sarah's fingers trembled as she backed away from the door. She couldn't breathe. The cold air, the weight of the dark, had thickened around her like a fog, suffocating her from every side. The faces, her own face, the distorted screams of the others, pressed in on her from every direction, their painted eyes gleaming with madness. And Elias was still there, wasn't he? He was everywhere. In the walls. In the floorboards. In the very paint that had coated this cabin's bones. "Finish it," Elias's voice echoed, impossibly close, like it was whispering right behind her ear. But when she spun around, there was no one there, only the flickering shadows. Sarah's legs trembled beneath her. She was losing her grip. Losing herself. It was all too much. Her mind raced as the weight of what was happening finally settled in her gut. She had thought the terror would end with Elias, that once his twisted influence was gone, she could walk away, forget it all. But the paintings had a life of their own, pulling her in, anchoring her to this cabin. To this nightmare. Her eyes flicked toward the canvas. It was there again! The empty space where the final stroke should have gone. Her face, twisted in that eternal scream, stared back at her. "No," Sarah whispered to herself, shaking her head violently. She wasn't going to let this consume her. She wasn't going to be a part of his art, a canvas for his madness. But the brush! It was still there. Lying on the floor where it had fallen. The handle was slick with some kind of oily residue, the bristles unnaturally still, waiting. She couldn't escape it. Every step she took, every breath she drew, the presence of the brush haunted her. It was as if she were being drawn back to it against her will, like a moth to the flame. Sarah collapsed to the floor, her hands shaking violently as she reached for the brush, gripped it tightly. It felt cold in her hands, as though it had been waiting for her to return. And she could almost feel the echo of Elias's twisted gaze, waiting for her to complete his masterpiece. Her pulse quickened as her fingers clenched around the handle. She didn't want this. She didn't want to become his final stroke, his final masterpiece. But the brush wouldn't let her go. The canvas beckoned. With a breathless gasp, Sarah stumbled forward, her knees giving way as she fell toward the easel. The faces on the wall seemed to close in, watching her with eager eyes, their painted mouths frozen in eternal screams. But she didn't care. She couldn't. She had to finish it. She had to break free. And in that moment, she understood. She wasn't just finishing a painting. She was ending it all, herself, her fate, and the last remnants of Elias's twisted control. Her hand reached up, trembling, as she dragged the brush across the canvas. The bristles seemed to fight against her at first, pulling back as if the brush itself had a mind of its own. But Sarah wasn't going to let it win. She wasn't going to be another victim, another scream on the walls. With every stroke, the world around her began to unravel. The air thickened with the suffocating pressure of something dark, something ancient. The figures in the painting screamed louder. The walls seemed to buckle as though they could no longer contain the horrors that were being unleashed. And then, with one final, violent stroke, Sarah finished it. The room fell deathly silent. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her chest heaving. The brush dropped from her hand, landing with a finality that echoed through the still room. It was over. The painting was complete. But there was something different. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was cold. It was final. Sarah lifted her head, her eyes widening as she looked at the canvas. It was no longer her face staring back at her. No, it was something far worse. It was Elias's face. Twisted, contorted in agony, frozen in the final moment of his madness. And it wasn't just on the canvas, it was everywhere. His face was plastered on the walls, the ceiling, even in the shadows that clung to the corners. He was still there. The walls of the cabin seemed to shift, to groan and creak as if the entire building itself were alive with the souls trapped within it. The paintings had consumed him, and now they were consuming her, too. She had become a part of it all, just another brushstroke in his deranged creation. But Sarah knew something now that she hadn't before: there was no escape. Not from Elias. Not from the madness. The cabin, the paintings, the brush, it was all one thing now, a twisted tapestry of death and despair. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and backed away from the canvas. It was over. There was no going back. And as she turned to leave, her eyes flicked to the corner of the room. There, on the floor, was the brush. Waiting. Watching. She hesitated, but only for a moment. A dark smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She walked out of the cabin, leaving the madness behind her. Or so she thought.